Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Anschluss failed. What exactly is the Anschluss? The Anschluss is a series of events that led to the annexation of Austria by Germany, of course. We could also extend it, for instance, to the Saarland and the Sudetenland. However, I will explicitly exclude those. I will let the remilitarization of the Rhineland happen as it did in OTL, and also the so-called Saar-Abstimmung, it will happen as well. So the smaller annexation of Saarland by Germany, it will also happen as it did in OTL. After World War I, the Allies forbade the Germans and the Austrians to unite into a single political entity. For Austria, this was a very dramatic thing, because on its own, Austria was afraid that they couldn't really survive. Most Austrians didn't see how they could be on their own in such a tiny Rom state, and there was also this saying that how could there be a world capital like Vienna in a small state like Austria, or the remainings of Austria-Hungary, which actually says a lot about the Austrian identity. And speaking of identity, I just want to recall you that most Austrians, they considered themselves back then in the days to be Germans, and there was thus a lot of support for the unification between Austria and Germany by most parties. There was also a tiny region, for instance, which called itself Vorarlberg. In there they had a different political agenda because they wanted to have a unification with Switzerland, which was a very different thing. But, well, it didn't happen, and hence the name Canton Übrig, the remaining canton, in English, it exists. Also there's this other expression of Deutsch-Österreich or Deutsch-Österreicher, which means German Austria or German Austrian. So these expressions, they were used very often in these times. Democracy was, as in the Weimar Republic, fairly weak, and also around the same time as in Germany, Austria also saw their own type of dictatorship, and this dictatorship was very different one in the sense of ideology, policies and everything around it. Engelbert Dollfuss was a member of the Vaterländische Front, the Christian Socials, who at around 1934 supported something called corporatism. This type of corporatism doesn't have anything to do with big companies, no. It is an idea that is very close to fascism. And as a result, Austria came also closer and closer to Italy, which in itself may seem as a surprise, especially for the fact that Italy annexed various parts that used to be of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But yeah, in these times, in the 30s, policies seemed to be a bit different. And after a failed coup d'etat in Austria, Mussolini, he immediately blamed the Nazis for it, and he even sent troops close to the Austrian border. He reaffirmed also the differences between fascism and National Socialism for many, many times. He also received Dollfuss and his family members many times in his private villa, for instance. And after the revolts which happened in Austria due to the failed coup and the death of Engelbert Dollfuss, a statue of Walter von der Vogelweide, a Germanic troubadour, it was replaced by a Roman general who conquered the Germanic parts, Drusus. Isn't it actually a funny move to make? Kurt Schuschnigg succeeded Dollfuss, and with the annexation of Albania and Ethiopia by Italy, well, Italy became very isolated, and they had to abandon their position on Austria and also compromise on it to somehow have an approachment with Germany. And in 1938, well, Austria was annexed after a plebiscite where most people voted in favor of a unification with Germany. But what if all of that changed? What if the Anschluss failed? The best point of divergence we could take would be that one of Mussolini not seeking approachment with Hitler. Even if he was politically isolated, he would still not see Hitler as a viable ally. He would still use these terms that he used to use, where he just said, it's just some guy there in the north, and that Italians and the Germans are very different. Austria had to remain independent under all costs, because he would need to reaffirm this, that Italy could have security in the Alps, so that Germany could not just invade Italy. And this could reinforce then Kurt Schuschnigg, who would now not be isolated in this new timeline, and he might still propose the same idea as he did in OTL. The plebiscite was Schuschnigg's idea after all, and at the end of the result of the plebiscite, we would have again the same outcome, but it would change in some ways. Mussolini, he was alarmed when he heard about the results, that the Austrians would favor the unification between Austria and the Germans. He saw images of Germans marching over the border and would intervene as a result. Because you have to remember that during the Anschluss, well, you also had Hitler who went there, but also many German policemen were suddenly ready, many German soldiers were ready, just in case something would happen, you know. The Alps, they are impassable, but with a complicated situation and chaos all around Austria, Mussolini might be able to get a small advantage, and he would also get the support of the Austrian Heimwehr. Please notice that not everyone was necessarily in favor of a unification, and maybe if they were pressured to side with one faction, they may actually side with the one that wanted independence, especially if suddenly Italian soldiers are crossing the border. So yeah, the choices, they would be easily made. This would not go unnoticed, and Hitler would be forced then to mobilize the whole Wehrmacht, and they would be supported by pro-Nazis all around Austria. Everything would be a mess, but with Germany being considerably weaker as compared to 1939, Italy might be able to at least expel the Germans in some regions, for some parts, but not everywhere. The Alps would be easy for the Italians to hold, while the urban places with many young people would be a stronghold for the Germans and the Nazi paramilitaries. The Allies, they would just watch at first and not do nothing at the moment. They would only intervene if needed. Czechoslovakia had their own problems and might fall as well after a coalition of German parties and Slovak parties would force them to do so. Poland, however, would have an interesting position. Why? Because Poland actually made a proposition around 1935 to France to invade Germany and to just topple off Hitler from there. Yeah, but the French, they rejected this proposition. So Italy, being somewhat desperate, could then propose the same to Poland, and Poland would gladly help them out. Germany would face a horror scenario, and the only country that could save them would be the Soviets. Polish advances would happen quickly in Eastern Prussia and also Pomerania. Germany had no chance to win, and it is known that Stalin accepted to invade Eastern Poland only because Germany was able to beat Poland kinda effortlessly and also really fast in the situation. However, in this scenario, I think that Stalin, he would reconsider a little bit his position. Stalin may at maximum demand territories from Poland, but not invade it immediately. Stalin would get in the conflict with Finland for sure, but that would be it for so far, yes. Stalin would also have to focus on that conflict that he would have with Finland, and Poland at the moment would not be that important. And without his involvement in Europe, except for Finland, Japan would be even more afraid of the Soviet Union and their advances in China, well, and the Pacific as well. They could be even slower because Japan would need to station some soldiers in the northern parts. I feel that with a war all around Czechoslovakia, a state like Czechoslovakia, they just couldn't hold themselves. And we would see that they would get dragged in some way or another into this conflict, be it because the Sudetendeutsche or the Germans of the Sudetenland, they would suddenly threaten the secession, or that the Slovaks, they would then declare independence, and somehow Poland might still make the mistake to take back Czech Teschin, which they had a war around, I think, 1919, 1920, at around the same month, so they had the Polish-Soviet War. So, yeah, in there Poland would make actually the mistake, and only then the Soviets could have an idea of how they could suddenly intervene in the Sul conflict. And they would do so because they had a treaty with Czechoslovakia that said that the Soviets, they would guarantee their independence and stuff like this. So yeah, the Soviets, they would then intervene, and the Allies, they would urge the Soviets to only take back Eastern Poland but not annex all of Poland, to which Stalin would agree. Czechoslovakia would serve as a good defense, and Poland would have to retreat from German parts. The Italians and pro-Austrians would have freed most of rural Austria by now, except for the border regions with Germany. And well, Poland being now thrown into a two-front war, the Wehrmacht and the pro-Nazis, they could again make some smaller gains. And the Allies, well, they would now be in a dilemma. They feared that the Soviets could just puppet or annex multiple states at once in Eastern Europe, while Germany would have a chance in annexing Austria and even parts of Poland. In order to prevent all of that, they would not only send support to Italy, but also intervene in this war now. A deal could be stricken between the Soviets and the Allies. The Allies would ask the Soviets to not annex Poland and to not take Czechoslovakia as their puppet state. But in return, the Soviets would ask to gain the whole of the Baltics as their part of the sphere of influence, to which the Allies, well, they wouldn't say anything big about it. Conflict between the Soviets and Poland would partially cease, and Poland would lose their eastern parts. As compensation, the Allies, they would allow Poland to take the territories up to the Oder-Neisse line, which was seen as more favorable than being part of the Soviet sphere of influence. Could Yugoslavia still intervene? Yes. Why? In a great moment of weakness, they might try to capture certain territories which belonged to Italy, where the majority was Croatian or Slovenian. With the Germans now being in trouble from all the sides, the Italians had now some troops which would be free up, and they could send those troops to Yugoslavia and eventually ask the Hungarians to participate in the invasion as well. At the end, well, Germany would lose, not badly, but just lose. Bavaria could be co-jointly occupied by Italy and Austria, while the Rhineland and the Saarland would get the same treatment as they did before Nazi intervention. Eastern Prussia would be divided between Poland and the Soviet Union. The shifting of Poland's borders westwards would still happen. Czechoslovakia would have a status quo. The Baltics would go to the Soviets, while Finland would still lose the certain territories as they did in OTL. Romania, Bulgaria might still fall to the Soviets after some time, while Hungary and Italy would dominate Yugoslavia. We would see a more moderate fascist regime in Croatia, and, well, Spain and Portugal may after some time become allies with Italy, at least in the economic perspectives. And then we would see the rise and the creation of a fascist bloc. The US would never gain some sort of influence in Europe, while France and Britain could still keep their colonies for a bit longer, but they alone would not be able to combat the influence of the Soviets. So it would be natural that after some time they would seek an alliance with the US, while the fascist bloc would seek to influence the Muslim world, for instance. Now you're asking yourself, why exactly the Muslim world? Well, because Mussolini gave himself the title of Protector of Islam. Baathism would thusly have a more Italian fascist touch to it, and, well, Austria, they would see themselves in debt to Italy, and they too would become part of this fascist bloc together with Bavaria. Poland would see themselves as the betrayed nation by the West and threatened by the East. And they could probably be somewhat closer to Italy and the fascist bloc, while Czechoslovakia would become akin to Otiat's Austria with a slightly more favorable opinion of the Soviet Union because they were saved by the Soviet Union. Fascism would compete with communism all around the world, and it could be seen as the ideology of freedom and strength, especially in the Muslim world, and also some other places around the world, while communism's popularity could slightly decrease. Once that Mussolini would die, this could lead to the slow collapse of the fascist bloc, and not only because of his death, but also because of the fact that Italy would never really become as strong as France, Britain and the Soviet Union or the US. With Mussolini gone, Croatia could start doing its own thing. A successor of Mussolini may be at odds with an elderly Franco, who would also soon die. Salazar would also be almost dead, and Austria as well as Bavaria, they would be the last ones to fall. Fascism would culturally and socially have a much bigger impact on the world than in OTL, and it could survive as some type of post-fascism, or we could see also the implementation of a democratic fascism. Eventually the Soviets could also fall, because I don't see them changing their geopolitics. They would still want to have an access in the Hot Sea, thus they would still go into Afghanistan. The economy would actually be worse off than in OTL with their many satellite states, which they wouldn't have in this timeline. And this would leave us with a world in which the US would slowly but surely gain influence and momentum. France and Britain may gain influence as well, or never really lose it that fast. And Poland could do so as well, and of course China. And that's where we leave it for now.
That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.